Dawn crawled over the ridge like a cautious animal, stretching pale light across a valley that no longer trusted the sun. The air tasted metallic, sharp with the scent of cold earth and burnt residue left from the night's scattered gunfire. For 19 days, the valley had woken with the same dread, a hushed expectation that something hostile was already moving beneath the sand, beneath the rock, beneath the bones of those stationed there. On this morning, a single brass casing lay half buried in frost. It glimmered faintly, as if insisting that the night had not fully ended. Men passing it would not have noticed, but record keepers and field investigators would later return to this ridge, tracing the pattern of impossible shots that came from this very stone lip. They would stand in the exact space where an unnamed sentinel once pressed her cheek against cold metal and breathed out the valley's reprieve. The attacks had begun with the rhythm of a curse. First one ambush, small, uncoordinated, like the testing of a lock. Then another, and another. Soon, the assaults grew in force and cunning, as if a distant mind were sculpting them with increasing impatience. 47 hostile advances in 19 days, a number that felt unnatural, almost ritualistic. Soldiers spoke in low voices at night, claiming the valley had become a hunting ground where they would prey, and the enemy was both shadow and whisper. Yet something strange kept happening. Each time the enemy gathered momentum, each time their approach promised a break through the line, a single shot cut through the air, a shot no one expected, a shot fired from an angle commanders had deemed unusable, a shot that dissolved the attacker's confidence like sand in running water. Those stationed in the valley called it luck at first, then providence. Then, with equal parts reverence and fear, they called her. They did not know her name. They did not know her silhouette. Some had only glimpsed a ripple of cloth on the ridge, or a flash of sunlight hitting the rim of a scope. Others saw nothing at all. The mystery suited the terrain, a labyrinth of cliffs and crags where sound died quickly and wind carried lies more faithfully than truth. But evidence spoke with a precision the rumors lacked. Field analysts found bullet paths that defied the common limits of field marksmanship, angles so clean they looked diagrammed rather than improvised, distances that stretched beyond standard expectations, requiring a hand not only trained but tempered. Each casing bore the faint signs of meticulous care, polished, cleaned, almost ceremonially prepared. Whoever this unseen guardian was, she worked not like a soldier fighting for survival, but like an archivist documenting inevitability. Her presence produced an unsettling paradox. Soldiers felt safer, yet also deeply aware of how fragile that safety was. They woke each morning wondering whether she would return to her post, unseen but decisive. They wondered whether she was a ghost invented by desperation, or a woman of flesh and bone whose steadiness outmatched their own fear. Days blurred. Dust storms spat grit into every crevice of equipment. Rally points turned to ash under the scorch of failed ambushes. The valley's defenders became accustomed to silence between bursts of violence, a silence so thick it behaved like a substance, pressing against the eardrums, waiting for the single shot that always arrived just before disaster. It would have been easier if she had been a myth. Myths demand only belief. But the battlefield evidence refused to accommodate illusion. Shell fragments, trajectory reports, wind analyses, the consistency of timing, all pointed to a lone operator with focus so severe it bordered on asceticism. Someone who understood that the valley was an organism. Someone who studied its breathing patterns, its shifting shadows, its small betrayals of movement. Her influence altered the enemy as well. Their early confidence faded. They began moving with exaggerated caution, as though expecting death to descend from angles they could not imagine. Scouts returned with strange stories. Tracks on ridges where no one should have been able to climb, disturbed gravel in places too exposed for ordinary surveillance, faint impressions in the soil that suggested prolonged stillness, hours of unmoving patience. And still, no one saw her fully. What little could be known of her came only through the violence she prevented. In those 19 days, the valley recorded no successful incursions, no broken lines, no lost men. What should have been a slaughter became a stalemate held together by a single unseen breath. Even officers, trained to dismiss superstition, began studying the ridge with a mixture of awe and unease. They traced maps of likely vantage points, but found that none accounted for the totality of her field of fire. It was as if she moved without leaving the trace of movement, appearing only in the language of ballistics and silence. The truth, when it finally surfaced in classified reports, revealed something more sobering than the soldiers' ghost stories. She was real, trained, hardened, and her presence in this valley was no accident. But that revelation belonged to another part of the story. For now, the valley had only begun to whisper her legend. It whispered through the stone still warm from the previous day's sun, through the discarded casing glinting in morning frost, through the silent breaths of men who had survived not because the enemy spared them, but because she did not. This was the place that first learned her name, though it would not speak aloud for many years. And as the morning widened, lighting the contours of battlefield like an awakening memory, the valley understood something its defenders had not yet realized. The greatest shot she ever fired had not happened yet, and when it came, it would end more than an attack. It would end the rhythm of fear itself. Her story did not begin with the valley. It began in a harsher silence, years earlier, in a settlement where winters arrived like conquerors and stayed out of spite. Snow pressed against the doors until it bent. Smoke from the stove drifted slowly, unwilling to rise in such cold. In that landscape, every choice felt narrowed by necessity. Every action, even survival, became an act of discipline. She grew up in a house where sound carried weight. Footsteps mattered. The crack of wood in a fire could signal danger if the winds shifted wrong. Her childhood was not marked by laughter or bright colors. It was shaped by the dense quiet of those who work with their hands and expect nothing in return. Her mother stitched torn coats until her eyes reddened. Her father tended snares and traps, often returned with more frost on his beard than food in his hands. There were no indulgences, only cold, only scarcity, only the steady pressure of a world that knew how to break the weak. And somewhere in that unrelenting environment, she learned to listen, not for voices, but for the subtle music of the natural world, the way branches snapped under weight, the way wind curled around stone, the way breath condensed into fleeting shapes that betrayed position. This attention, initially born from survival, slowly sharpened into something like talent. Her first encounter with a rifle was not heroic. It was clumsy, heavy, awkward, though it felt too large for her hands, the metal too cold against her cheek. Yet she returned to it again and again, drawn by the strange calm that settled over her when she aligned the sights, when the world narrowed into a single point of focus. She was poor, but discipline cost nothing. And discipline, she discovered, could shape the impossible. It was an elderly neighbor, a retired marksman with joints stiff from forgotten campaigns, who refined her skill. He spoke little, preferring to teach through repetition. Hours passed as she practiced controlling her breath, reducing it to measured intervals until her heartbeat itself seemed to quiet. She learned to interpret distance not as a number but as a relationship between air, gravity, and time. She learned to read wind like scripture. By the time she reached adulthood, her patience had become a weapon far sharper than any blade the settlement possessed. But talent alone does not decide a path. What pushed her toward the uniform was the slow erosion of the world around her, the tension creeping across borders, the growing unrest that strangled trade routes, the rumors of escalating violence on the frontier. Recruitment posters began appearing in the settlement, plastered over cracked walls and shuttered shops. Words like duty and honor were printed boldly, but beneath them lay the true message. The state needed bodies, and it preferred ones hardened by hardship. She did not join out of ambition. She joined because she understood the weight of inevitability. The world was moving toward conflict, and she had no illusions that remote villages could remain untouched. Better to step into the storm deliberately than wait for it to arrive uninvited. Training introduced its own form of code, a manufactured discipline that demanded perfection. Recruits were pushed to the limits of endurance, punished for hesitation, rewarded for obedience. But while others learned to shoot with competence, she learned to shoot with purpose. Her instructors noticed the difference. When others trembled during long-range drills, she grew still. When the wind sabotaged trajectories, she adjusted without complaint. When commanders tested patience by forcing recruits to remain prone for hours, unmoving, she found solace in the stillness. It reminded her of home. Her rise was quiet, almost reluctant. Commendations came not from boastful performance, but from the consistent, almost eerie accuracy she demonstrated. After months of evaluation, she was elected for advanced marksmanship instruction, a program designed not for sharpshooters, but for those capable of reading an entire battlefield through a scope. There, she learned the true philosophy of the role she would someday play. Snipers, they told her, were not hunters. They were custodians of space, guardians of small margins between survival and annihilation. Their duty was not to kill, but to alter the momentum of conflict with precision. A single shot could shift a battle. A single breath could restore or destroy a fragile advantage. This idea stayed with her long after training ended. When she was deployed to the frontier, the conflict had already reached a fevered stage. Rumors spread of relentless assaults, of soldiers overwhelmed by ambushes that arrived with cruel efficiency. The valley where she would eventually leave her invisible signature was more than a battlefield. It was a collapsing boundary between order and chaos. Command needed someone capable not of brute force, but of controlling distance, fear, and timing. Her assignment was given without ceremony. A sealed folder, coordinates, a brief warning that the terrain consumed the inexperienced. She accepted it with a nod, her face unreadable. But inside, she felt the same stillness she had known on the ridge as a child, listening to wind carry secrets across the frozen land. The valley would not intimidate her. It would challenge her. And challenge, she had learned, was merely another form of clarity. When she arrived, the defenders were already exhausted. Their eyes carried the weight of nights spent waiting for shadows to move against them. They did not yet trust her, nor did they need to. She was not there for camaraderie. She was there to find a vantage point high enough, stable enough, unforgiving enough to give her the angle she required. She found on the third day a ridge that felt like an extension of her own breath, with lines of sight so unforgiving they demanded perfection. It was there she settled. It was there she listened again to the valley's shifting rhythms, studying its topography until every outcrop, every patch of sand, every deceptive shadow became familiar. And it was from that ridge that her legend would grow, though she did not seek it. She sought only to stem the incoming tide, to reduce chaos to measurable intervals, to create a pattern strong enough for others to survive long enough to see another dawn. What she could not yet know was that the valley would not simply record her presence. It would be transformed by it. And in the days to come, her discipline would collide with a threat engineered to break the strongest lines. The greatest test of her life was approaching. Carried on the wind like a warning she felt before she fully understood it. The first attack of the 19-day siege arrived under a veil of dust. It rolled across the valley like a slow-moving bruise, soft at the edges but darkening with intent. Soldiers tightened their grips on rifles, eyes stinging from the grit that scraped across their vision. The air hummed with low, static tension, the kind that precedes an event already set in motion. From her ridge, she watched the disturbance with the calm precision of someone studying a familiar pattern. The enemy's advance was not bold. It was calculated. Small clusters shifting low to the ground, using both terrain and chaos as shields. Their movement suggested experience. Men who understood how to stretch fear into a tactical advantage. But they did not yet understand her. She tracked their path through the dust, not following shapes but reading the subtle distortions in color and density. Each shift in the haze revealed momentum. Each flicker of shadow revealed intent. When the first shot cracked through the valley, fired by a defender below, it was misaligned, rushed, swallowed by panic. The enemy surged forward. Their confidence bloomed with the mistake, swelling into aggressive formation. For an instant, the valley felt predestined to collapse. But before fear could take full shape, another sound threaded through the air, a single, sharp report echoing from a ridge. One shot. Clean. Precise. The lead attacker fell, his collapse rippling uncertainty through his comrades. The valley stilled. A new kind of silence took hold, a silence not born of fear, but of recalculation. And in that slender pause, the enemy retreated, not yet defeated but clearly unsettled. This was the first time the defenders felt her presence, though they still did not know who she was. Nor did they ask. War teaches men to embrace miracles without demanding signatures. The second attack came at night. Darkness blanketed the valley with predatory patience. The only light came from slivers of moon bouncing off jagged rock. In such a landscape, movement was almost invisible, almost. She listened, letting sound guide her in a world where light could not. The faint scuff of stone, the soft rhythm of feet attempting silence. Men, believing themselves ghosts. She exhaled, letting her breath merge with the night. And again one shot, then another, not rapid, not panicked, each spaced with patient calculation, cutting through layers of darkness until the last intruder fled into shadow. Below, soldiers watched in awe as muzzle flashes flickered like distant stars, always in the exact spot needed, never wasted. By the end of the fourth day, the pattern had been established. The enemy would probe, test feint, withdraw. Each time she answered, each time their confidence eroded, and each time the defenders felt their own resolve harden in ways they could not explain. Still, the enemy adapted. On the seventh day, they sent decoys, scattering them across the terrain like broken shards of strategy, fast-moving silhouettes designed to confuse her sightline. For a moment, even she felt the valley's uncertainty. The air seemed fractured, broken into competing signals. But she had learned long ago that confusion is merely another form of truth disguised in motion. She watched the decoys carefully, noticing the one detail that separated real threat from imitation: intention. Decoys ran carelessly. True attackers moved with hunger. Her shots fell on the hungry ones. 3 silhouettes dropped. The rest dissolved into the dust. What followed was not triumph, but escalation. By the 10th day, the valley's edges bore the marks of relentless conflict: disturbed soil, scattered debris, the lingering smell of gunpowder trapped in heat. The defenders grew weary, drained by sleepless nights and the steady pulse of dread. Yet they endured, held aloft by the certainty that someone unseen was watching the horizon for them. But endurance has limits, and the enemy knew it. On the 13th day, they launched their most coordinated strike yet, a synchronized assault from 2 flanks, timed with the rising wind that muddied sound and sight. Soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting over the howl of the storm. Visibility shrank to almost nothing. Dust burned the eyes. Shapes twisted into illusions. From her ridge, she felt the storm like a physical blow. The wind distorted her calculations, bending trajectories, shifting the valley's topography with every passing second. She adjusted, recalibrated, waited for the storm's rhythm to reveal its brief, predictable windows of stillness. Only in those fleeting instants could she fire. A single low. She inhaled, fired. The shot cut through the storm, striking the figure coordinating the left flank's advance. Another brief stillness. She fired again, halting the right. Below, the defenders felt the shift instantly. What had seemed like an inevitable breach dissolved into disarray. With their leadership eliminated, the attackers scattered like startled birds, swallowed by their own momentum. By the end of that day, the defenders realized something unsettling. She was no longer simply supporting them. She was the fulcrum on which their survival balanced. But the enemy learned as well. By the 17th day, they stopped behaving like an ordinary force. Their movements became irregular, shaped by desperation rather than coordination. They abandoned predictable paths and adopted erratic, sporadic advances intended to break her rhythm. And for a moment, it worked. Their disordered motion felt like noise, the kind of noise capable of overwhelming precision. Yet she had lived her entire life studying the language of chaos. Where others saw randomness, she found patterns, tension, sequence, instinct. She adapted again. The 18th day passed with an eerie calm. No movement, no shots, no taunts. The valley felt suspended, a held breath waiting to exhale. And then came the 19th day, a day that began with perfect silence, as if the world itself was bracing. A day when even the wind refused to move. A day when the absence of noise felt louder than battle. She knew immediately this was not retreat. It was preparation. Something larger, something different was coming. And in the stillness of that morning, settled on her ridge with her cheek against cold metal. She understood that the valley had reached the brink of its final question. The next shot she fired would not simply repel an attack. It would decide what and who survived the day to come. The 19th day unfolded with a kind of unnatural purity, a morning so still it felt erased, as though the valley were holding its breath before judgment. Even the dust, normally restless, hung motionless in the pale light. The defenders sensed it immediately. This was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of intention. From her ridge, she studied the terrain with the precision of someone deciphering a coded message. The valley seemed unchanged, but its silence betrayed a new architecture of danger. No movement, no sound, just an expanse of waiting. She had learned long ago that enemy quiet was never emptiness. It was rearrangement, strategy aligning itself in the folds of silence. She steadied her pulse, letting the familiar rhythm anchor her, while uncertainty pulled across the horizon. It began at the far end of the valley, a faint shimmer of motion, almost imperceptible. Then another, not an attack, not a formation, a gathering. The enemy was consolidating, drawing every surviving unit into a single concentrated force. A final push, a storm forged not from numbers alone, but from the accumulated desperation of 18 failed attempts. Through her scope, she saw a shape swelling against the low light, expanding like a shadow uncoiling. Their approach was not reckless. It was synchronized, disciplined in a way that suggested outside influence, a commander who had learned her patterns, who understood that brute repetition could not defeat precision. The defenders braced below, weapons trembling in hands that had known too many nights of near defeat. They looked at the ridge with the quiet, instinctive hope of men waiting for a miracle. But miracles were not what she offered. She offered calculation. She inhaled, letting the valley's thin air settle into her chest. Every skill she had ever learned, the breath control, the wind reading, the patience carved from hardship, gathered into a single point of focus. The enemy advanced. Their movement was slower this time, as if deliberately removing the frantic errors of earlier days. They spread wide enough to dilute her angles, but close enough to retain cohesion. They shifted unpredictably, but not chaotically. It was a formation designed to challenge her, to force her into hesitation, to overwhelm her precision through sheer density. She did not fire. Not yet. She tracked the shape of their momentum, studying the subtle gestures that revealed hierarchy. A tilt of the head, a hand lifted in command, a step that others mirrored a beat later. She found the anchor, the figure whose silent order stitched the formation together. He moved confidently, assured that numbers would smother even the most gifted marksman. But he underestimated the conditions of the ridge. The wind was changing, rising in narrow, deliberate currents that twisted unpredictably before settling into momentary clarity. Those windows, fleeting pockets of still air, were her opportunity. They lasted mere seconds before collapsing back into turbulence. She timed them. Below, the defenders fired their first volley, the sound bursting like fractured stone. But the enemy did not falter. Their advance quickened. The defenders scrambled back, their fear no longer a whisper, but a visible tremor shifting through the line. Still, she did not fire, because she saw it the true threat, not the advancing ranks, not the formation, but the machine being assembled behind them, its barrel angled with surgical intent. A long-range weapon, crude but devastating. A shot powerful enough to tear open the defender's last stronghold in a single strike. It was positioned deliberately, far beyond ordinary counterfire range. Far beyond, except for her. She aligned her scope not on the commander, not on the vanguard, but on the operator crouched behind the weapon. He moved with the fluidity of experience. He knew his role. He believed the ridge would be too distant for her to intervene. He did not know the obsession with which she studied terrain. She exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the rifle merge with the weight of her own stillness. The valley narrowed, sound dimmed, time thinned. A brief lull in the wind opened, a moment small enough to be mistaken for imagination. She fired. The shot cut through the morning like a blade drawn across fabric. It traveled an impossible distance, riding the current she had calculated down to its smallest tremor. The operator collapsed. The machine fell silent. A fracture cracked through the enemy formation, subtle at first, then widening as panic dissolved their unified momentum. The commander shouted, but his orders fell hollow now, untethered from the structure that had given them strength. She chambered another round with movements slow and practiced, allowing the valley to reveal its next weakness. There, the commander himself, now exposed by the unraveling of his force. She waited for the second wind window. When it came, she took it. He dropped, and with him, the final ambition of the 19-day campaign. What followed was not triumph. It was unraveling. The attackers scrambled, their formation collapsing inward like a fabric losing its seams. Some fled, some hesitated, some simply froze, their resolve shattered by a force they still could not see. Below, the defenders lowered their weapons in disbelief. Relief washed over them not as celebration, but as exhaustion so deep it bordered on collapse. Men sank to their knees, trembling with the release of fear that had tightened their bones for weeks. On the ridge, she remained still. Her breath returned to its natural cadence. Her heartbeat steadied. She watched until the valley quieted, not trusting relief until she had confirmed the silence was real. When she finally lowered her rifle, the morning light struck the metal, turning it briefly into a thin line of silver, the only evidence that the impossible shot had been real, not legend. In that moment, the valley changed. It was no longer a grave waiting to be filled. It became a testament to a single choice, a single breath, a single shot that rewrote its fate. And though her name would remain hidden in reports and buried in classified files, the valley would remember her, not through monuments, not through ceremony, but through the enduring truth that some battles are won not by armies, but by the unwavering stillness of one unseen soul. She stood, felt the earth steady beneath her boots, and walked away from a ridge, leaving behind only silence, frost, and the echo of a shot that ended 47 attacks in 19 days. A shot that outlived her footsteps.